Welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. I'm Eleanor Haley.
And I'm Lisa Williams. We're the mental health professionals turned grief friends turned co-founders of the website What's Your Grief.
In this podcast, we talk candidly about all things grief, from pop culture to grief theory.
No tilted heads, no soothing tones, just us and our grief friends exploring the always devastating,
often confusing,
and sometimes even funny experience of living life after loss.
Hey, welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. This is Eleanor, and I'm joined by Lisa. Hey, Lisa.
Hey.
We are glad people are here to join us today. We have a couple things that we want to share before we get into the topic of today's podcast. The first one is that we have a webinar coming up.
Yeah, next Wednesday. It will be February the 12th, I believe. Yes. We are doing a webinar that is sort of a trauma 101 in answering some questions that get into really kind of what's the difference between grief and trauma, where are the overlaps. We get a lot of questions from people about what is grief, what is trauma, what are trauma symptoms, when do I need trauma treatment and support rather than just grief support. So we're just going to do a webinar trying to clarify and answer some of those questions. So I will put the link to it down in the show notes. It's a free webinar. So hopefully if that sounds like questions you've been asking, you can tune in.
Yeah, I think that could be a really helpful topic for a lot of people, just because when you have experienced a potentially traumatic experience, there is almost always grief and it all gets really mixed up. It's not like you have these two compartments of things, you know? So I do think that it can be helpful just to be able to sort of conceptualize it. And also just what types of, ways of coping, therapeutic approaches, things like that can be helpful for these things, can be really useful to people.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to give you a place to start, if you're thinking about getting trauma support and don't know where to begin, we will definitely cover some answers to those questions.
Okay. And also for anybody who is a professional who needs continuing education, we want to share that our monthly continuing education session is coming up. For those of you who don't know, we do one a month with a couple exceptions. There's a couple months that we have off. Our whole calendar is available now, but we do one 3 CE session every month on a topic that is related to grief and loss somehow.
Yes. And this month, it is going to be on the 13th, so the day after the webinar. And it is on attachment theory and continuing bonds in grief. So we will, just be looking at what the world of attachment tells us about loss, how attachment might inform your work with people who are grieving, and then thinking about continuing bonds in that framework as well. So I will also put the link to that in the show notes.
And we welcome everybody to attend those. There is a fee to register. It's not free like our webinar. We invite anybody who's interested to register for it, even if you're not a professional who needs continuing education. Maybe you're a student. Maybe you're just somebody who's interested in the topic. So we welcome anyone to join if that's something that is interesting to them. So with that, I think we can talk a little bit about what we want to cover today. Actually, we're kind of digging back into the archives a little bit because today we want to have a discussion about our different grieving styles. And we think that this is such an important topic to discuss because it explains a little bit of why we all grieve differently. Now, there are a lot of reasons why we all grieve differently. One is that we all have our own unique relationship with the person who died, and that really influences things. But what we bring in terms of our approach to handling things like stress and grief and loss is a really, really significant factor. And this is not the first time we've addressed this. As I've said, we've talked about this in many different ways over the years. But one of the things we want to do is readdress some of those topics that we addressed a long, long time ago, just to kind of give it our updated, refreshed take. It's something that we wrote about in our book. We dedicate a little time to encouraging people to think through what their grief coping style is. So we're going to touch on what we discussed in our book and what we've discussed in the past, and then maybe add a few other factors that we have been thinking about and noticing, well, yeah, that of course is going to impact the way that we approach grief and loss.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that this feels so important is that it isn't just about our own grief and understanding. I mean, it certainly, of course, is about understanding our own grief style and coping style. And that's really helpful for self-awareness and developing our own approach to how we cope after loss. But I think it's especially important because of that dynamic family systems part of grief and the fact that we're rarely grieving in isolation. Oftentimes we are interacting with other people who have been impacted by the same loss that we have, whether that's family members or friends or coworkers, members of our community. And I think oftentimes one of the challenges is that we're in that space where we're devastated by loss. We're trying to understand and make sense of our own grief and what's happening and our own coping. And then we're sometimes trying to make sense of other people's as well, or we're noticing the ways that our grief style differs from the people who are around us or some of the people around us, and maybe is similar to some of the people around us. So one of the reasons I think this is just such an important one for us to cover is because it oftentimes helps families and communities to just better understand each other a little bit in grief, and then therefore better give support and receive support when they understand all these different factors and styles that might be at play.
Yeah, and I think that can somewhat extend to thinking about who we look to for support as well. It might not relate to their grief coping style per se, but their style in helping people and being present with emotion and other things that are related to our loss, I think can be a really significant and important factor. You know, not everybody is good with emotion. Not everybody is good with being kind of practical and things like that. So I do think thinking about how we're unique helps us to think, like you said, how others are unique, both within that system and then within that like support system. So family system and support system as well. So if you were to start this conversation, I know what we talk about in our book and what we've talked about on our website and in the past, but what do you think is one of the most important factors, would you say?
For me, I think there is maybe a couple ways of thinking about it. There are some of the ones that are just really foundational to how we interact in the world in general. And then there are some of the ones that I think for grief offer that real aha moment of grief. And so I think maybe thinking at least from the foundational side of just what are some of the factors that feel so important to just thinking about how we cope in general in the world. I think thinking about things like are we introverts or extroverts, and are we optimists or pessimists are the ones that I think just impact so much of our way of being in the world that it's worth acknowledging them before we dive into maybe some of the grief specific considerations.
Yeah, actually, like thinking back to some of the early articles that we wrote on What's Your Grief, one of the first ones that we wrote in this kind of arena was about being an introvert in grief. I wrote one about being an introvert in grief because I am fully an introvert. And then you, is an extrovert, wrote one about being an extrovert in grief, because I definitely see how this can impact our grief coping style and the type of support that we want, and maybe present some challenges in our grief. I will speak on my end of the spectrum as somebody who is introverted. I think, introverts, they're people who are social just like everybody else, but they may have smaller groups of people. They may enjoy spending time with a few people as opposed to being at a big, huge gathering. They often draw their energy from being alone at times. They get their fill of being around people a little bit more easily. And so I think that being an introvert, there are some things that I think could be challenges that pop out to me. And one is that you may just have like a smaller network, because that's kind of what you gravitate towards, is having like maybe a smaller, more closer, more intimate network of people. And when you have a small network, it might be great. It might be fine because those people are really present and there for you. But you also could run into the situation where you're like, I don't have that many people to sort of lean on. I think also if you're an introvert, you may be less likely to gravitate towards environments that are more like social support type of situations, like support groups, things like that, especially if it's like walking into a room of strangers and kind of unknowns, things like small talk and getting through a lot of that stuff can be really difficult for people who are introverted, at the very least unappealing. So I think that they may not gravitate towards those types of environments. That doesn't mean, again, that they don't want that social interaction or they wouldn't benefit from social support, but maybe they might be the type of person who wants a more one-on-one interaction, or maybe would want to talk to a therapist instead of a big group, or who would feel more comfortable maybe going with a friend to a group, so it's not just walking into a room of strangers. So I think that there are some unique things about being an introvert. Also, as somebody who's definitely grappled with this over the years, I think when you are somebody who maybe gravitates towards alone time and maybe being in your own kind of comfortable space, I do think you oftentimes reach that tipping point where you're like, when is it too much? When is it too much time alone and at home? I am comfortable here. There's a lot that feels good about being here and being alone. But at the same time, I now feel like maybe I am avoiding connecting with other people and going out into the world and having certain experiences. And I'm now starting to feel a little cut off and isolated because my comfort zone, has been such a comfort, but I have now hit that kind of tipping point where I feel like maybe I've gotten to the place where it's too much. So there are definitely some considerations, I think, for introverts, just as there are for extroverts who might have some opposite type of experiences.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the one you just described of the way that avoidance or how much time we spend may play out differently. And you might think, oh, well, if it's a risk for introverts that they lean too much into alone time, at least extroverts don't have that issue. Well, sometimes extroverts will share exactly the opposite, that they realize that their form of avoidance after loss was just never being alone with their own feelings, deciding to keep themselves incredibly busy, to lean on the fact that maybe they do have a bigger support network, or if not a bigger support network, just more comfort in going out into social situations and not finding those as depleting and exhausting. And so therefore they can become an easy avoidance tool. So it is really important on the extrovert end of the spectrum to just consider, is that something that's going on? Is it that you're not giving yourself the space that you need to get comfortable with being alone with your grief and alone with the pain of that loss? It is so wonderful to be able to lean on a support system. And also, we do need to make sure that we are able to be with our own emotions and feelings. So I think that can be a really important consideration. I think also on the other side, though, you may be an extrovert who is lucky to have a big support system. They may not all be people, or even many be people, who are really able to be present with your grief. We have wonderful people who meet needs for us of all different types. And you may find that some of the people who are in your life are wonderful friends, but you just don't feel like they're aligning with what you need. And sometimes that can put us in this place where we're like, oh, what does this mean that I have this huge support system and yet I'm still not able to find somebody I can connect with or get my needs met in a certain way? We've talked before on the podcast about the idea that loneliness isn't just about being alone. It's oftentimes about not having the type of relationship that we need or are looking for. And so if the type of relationship that you need or are looking for is a certain type of grief support and you're not getting it, then you still might feel a sense of loneliness even within your support system, especially if you feel like it sort of should be there. I think the other piece with extroversion in grief support that we do hear about a lot is that you may gravitate toward something like a support group as a way to connect with other people, or just, if not a formal support group, connecting with other people in grief. But that can also become very heavy. You know, it is just carrying our own grief is incredibly heavy. And sometimes being in a position where you're now taking on the grief of others, maybe feeling like you need to step in for that mutual support, which is critical to any sort of grief support space with many people, it can also start to feel depleting or especially exhausting when we feel like maybe we weren't quite ready to give as much as was required of us in some of those spaces. And I think the last one that I'll say, maybe from a personal perspective, that can be a little bit tricky, is that just because you are an extrovert doesn't mean that you're necessarily a support group person. And so I think that's a consideration as well. When we get into some of the other pieces of what our style is, we may be somebody who is extroverted, but we ourselves are a little bit more instrumental in our grief. So we don't necessarily connect through talking about grief emotions as much. Or maybe you're an extrovert, but you're still learning to get comfortable with your emotions. And so that talking to other people about your emotions and your grief might not actually be something you're feeling ready for or prepared for, but other people might be thinking, oh, you know, you're usually really extroverted, you're a social person, it makes sense that you would want to connect with other people in grief. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Part of it is understanding that there are many different facets to our style and personality, and all of them come together in different ways.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Just because you might be somebody who gravitates towards people, that doesn't necessarily mean that that is how you gravitate towards processing and coping with emotions. So we can't make that assumption. I think the tip not to make assumptions is a good one in general. I think if you think about it, introversion and extroversion, it's a continuum any day of the year, right? Taking grief out of it. And so you may be somebody who's kind of more in the middle. You may feel that in your grief and after experiencing loss, you're being kind of pulled in a new direction and you're feeling a little bit different. So I would say be kind of aware, self-aware, and open to what your body and mind are telling you, because a lot of people might assume, oh, Litsa has this gigantic support network. She likes being around people. So I'm going to show up to her house, or I'm going to assume she wants me here, or I'm going to assume she wants me to drag her out of the house, drag her to the support group. And maybe that's not what Litsa wants in her grief. Maybe she's feeling a little more introverted. Maybe she's drained more easily by those types of experiences. On the other hand, there might be somebody who's more introverted and you know, they say to themselves, I'm not a support group person. I'm not a person who goes to groups. Or maybe their friends are like, oh, I shouldn't encourage that because that's not something that they would ever say yes to. But they're finding that that's something that they really are kind of longing for, those types of connections. So I think, you know, kind of taking things with a grain of salt, but paying attention to what we're feeling is good, because our experiences can change the way we feel. Sometimes temporarily, and sometimes even for longer periods of time. So the other one that you mentioned in kind of just like one of those foundational things is optimism and pessimism, which I think is interesting to talk about, because people, I think whenever we bring up optimism, people automatically assume, oh, you're going to be toxic positivity now. And you're going to try to push me towards being positive and being happy or grateful and things like that. And that's not really what this means, right?
No, definitely not. I think especially when we look at it really from a mental health perspective and not just how we use the terms colloquially, it is really about what they call our explanatory style. So our explanatory style is really the way that we make sense of how things have how and why things have happened in the world and what the impact is. So we have an explanatory style, and sometimes what we attribute as the cause of situations and what the impact will be is really what determines whether we're an optimist or a pessimist. And so if we're optimistic, it doesn't mean that we're saying nothing bad happened. Optimists are just as devastated by loss as pessimists are, the pain of grief, the pain of losing someone. Your optimism doesn't protect you in some way from the deep pain of loss. But that explanatory style does change the story that we tell ourselves. So an optimist will be less likely to sort of internalize the situations around their grief and think either this was my fault, or kind of have that why me feeling that is feeling like this is so specific to me, or I'm kind of uniquely a victim of grief. And they'll sometimes, a optimist will see things as this grief is part of life. This isn't something that was my fault. This is sort of a why not me situation. I know that loss happens to everyone in some way at some time. I see those kind of connections to the things that are external rather than those seeing it as some sort of internal failure. I'm more likely as an optimist to see that though this loss will always be with me, that grief will always be with me, that it doesn't mean that I'm broken in some way. A pessimist will be more likely to think this, having gone through this, means that I will never be healed, or my life will never be able to have meaning and purpose again. So that might be a little bit harder to have hope, or to feel like we're active participants in our grief, and to feel like it's worth it to try to seek out grief support. If I'm really pessimistic to the possibility that I'll ever be able to have meaningful relationships again because I feel so misunderstood, they'll think, oh, this is permanent. If a few people say the wrong thing to me early in grief, they'll be more likely to think no one understands. I'm never going to be able to find people to connect with me. Whereas a more optimistic person might say, wow, that person really didn't get it, or my support system is really struggling to support me right now. And I know that there are other people who do get it, or I believe that with some time and attention, that in the future, I'll be able to mend things with my support system, and they'll be able to be a good support to me again. There's also some stuff about how pervasive we see it within our life. But I think the long and short of all of this is when we look at what does this mean for our coping, that the pain is so deeply intense for optimists and pessimists, but pessimists might close themselves off to certain types of support, thinking that it's not worth it. It's not worth even trying because I'm so convinced that I won't be able to get any better, or I won't be able to find any sort of support. So it does have a real difference in how we reach out to others or how we reach out for support.
Yeah, it's really actually even though we, like you said, we throw around these terms quite often and assume we know what they mean, in psychology, it's a complex topic. And so
Definitely.
we'll link to whatever we can to help people who are interested dive a little more in depth to this, because there is a lot to it. And really identifying where you think you fit is a little more complicated than you would think. Like, I would probably have thought I would be more cynical. I'm very like realistic. I often notice the negative, I, have my fair share of anxiety, things like that. But in thinking about my explanatory style, I do think it's more optimistic. You would never like guess that about me, I don't think. So I think that it's not always quite obvious even to maybe yourself, but it does have some real implications. And also, it's something that may feel pretty ingrained in us. However, it is not necessarily something we can't shift. There's a whole book written by Martin Seligman called Learned Optimism about how we may be able to shift our outlook a little bit if that's something is important to us. So there's a lot to this that I think we can learn if it's something that is interesting to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it can be helpful. I won't go down a whole other road about this, but it can be helpful when we learn this to realize that often the shifts that we need to make are small. In terms of learned optimism, there are small things around our explanatory style that can make a big difference in creating an openness for us. And there's another way of, I think, sort of talking about this that came up recently because a new book was released that was talking about the difference between cynicism and hopeful skepticism, and saying that there's really this big difference between being cynical and being skeptical, because cynicism, I think, a lot like pessimism, it takes away our agency. It says there's nothing we can do about this. And hopeful skepticism is really this process of waiting for evidence and testing things, and not just assuming that a certain type of support won't be helpful, or not just assuming that nobody can understand, or not just assuming that we're never going to form new relationships again. It says we have to go out in the world and test these things. If we just sit at home and believe that they're probably true, we're setting ourselves up for helplessness. Whereas, we might be skeptical, we might be dubious, we might think, oh, I don't know if this is going to be for me. But having that hopeful skepticism that allows us a willingness to just give it a shot goes a long way, because often we surprise ourselves and we find that there are things that we enjoyed or that were at least better than we expected. So there's a lot of ways to play with this if you think of yourself as kind of cynical or pessimistic.
Yeah. Another factor that is I guess grief related. This is specifically related to how we cope with grief. It was described by Kenneth Doka and Terry Martin, who work in the grief space. They're researchers and writers about grief. So we're getting kind of into that realm of things. And Lisa mentioned this in the beginning a little bit, is whether we are what we would call an instrumental griever or an intuitive griever. And this actually isn't an either or thing. Again, this is a continuum where very rarely is somebody on the polar ends of each spectrum. You're more likely somewhere in the middle. And so we talked about this a lot. I'm sure you've heard us bring up these terms in the past, but just kind of in a nutshell, what they talked about when they wrote about this was how our society tends to think that grief is going to look a certain way. It tends to think that grief is going to be the person who is emotional, who is crying, who needs to talk it out, who needs to go to a support group and have those conversations, who's really focused on whatever emotion is coming up in them. And that is one way. That is a way that many people do grieve and process and experience their emotions. And this is what they call an intuitive griever. So that's the label that they put on this. So that's what we more stereotypically think of and expect to see in grief. But what they said is that there are many healthy ways to cope with grief, and that's just one of them. And actually, over on the other end of this spectrum, we have what we call an instrumental griever. And that is somebody who is not really focused on emotion so much as more focused on their thoughts, their cognitions. They may be somebody who is a little more hands-on in their grief. So rather than sitting and experiencing and expressing emotion, they're more somebody who is going to try and really be maybe more tactile in how they engage with their grief and with their loss, with the person who died. Maybe they might be the person who really wants to throw themselves into planning a memorial service, or they might be the person who actually really wants to go through their loved one's belongings because it's more active, it's more doing. They may be really focused more on what they're thinking, what they thought at the time of the loss, as opposed to what they felt at the time of the loss. And that can be like a subtle difference. But what they said is that because we expect it to be one way and it sometimes is another, that other end of the spectrum, that instrumental, that more hands-on type of griever is often a little disenfranchised. People often say, what's wrong with you? Why are you already ready to move into planning a memorial service? Why are you already ready to go through their belongings? They often will say, this person is just avoiding their grief because they're not crying. They're not expressing their emotions. When in reality, they're just coping in a different way. But you can see when we don't normalize and understand that both ways are healthy and exist quite often, you have a dynamic where people don't understand each other and people are misinterpreting the actions of the other. Like, I encourage you to consider like a couple where one is more instrumental and one is more intuitive. One person really feels the need to sit with their emotions and to process and to express their emotions. And the other one looks a little more stoic and is a little more kind of active and hands-on, and how they might not be able to kind of be there for each other and support each other and understand each other because what they gravitate towards in their coping is so different.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons this is so important is that when people start to understand each other and understand these styles, there can be a lot more consideration for how do we work together even though our style might not be the same. How do we recognize that we might not be the best person to meet that other person's needs and vice versa? We might need to look at, like in the example you gave of a couple, we might need to figure out how can we be there for one another, and also how might we need to find some people or resources outside of the relationship that are going to meet some of the other grief needs that we have. So I think that can be really important. It can also be really important to just give yourself permission to be comfortable with whatever your grief style is, especially I think if you're a little bit more instrumental. It can be tricky sometimes because it feels like the grief support that's out there is often geared towards intuitive grievers. It's about coming together to process emotions or doing that with other people in a way that feels a little bit foreign. And what research has even found is just less helpful. It's not as helpful for instrumental grievers. Even when they try to engage with those types of support, they don't find it as beneficial. And so to be able to recognize, you know what, I might not be someone who a support group in that way is working for, or a traditional type of talk therapy that really focuses heavily on emotions. And so it's going to be important for me to figure out what alternatives exist and not just assume, okay, just no grief support works for me, but instead say, all right, it might be a different type of grief support that works for me. It might be more learning oriented. Like you said, Eleanor, it might be more doing oriented, more focused on action, and just kind of knowing that that's okay.
Yeah, you said that like some of the things that are considered normal and healthy are those things where you're crying it out and talking it out and getting together and showing others how much you're grieving. And like we said, that's just one way. And it is possible to cope with your experiences without ever talking it out, without ever crying it out. Many people say they didn't cry and they don't cry. So it is definitely possible to find all these outlets. And it's important for people to know that there are so many healthy and constructive ways. One of the things that we talked about early on in What's Your Grief is to think about, like, what types of outlets have you always gravitated towards, and do you feel yourself gravitating towards now? If it is expressing the emotion and talking it out, then that's one thing. Like, yeah, therapist would be great. A good friend who you can talk to, a support group, a journal would be great. But if that's not you, many people do gravitate towards that more practical side of things, towards that rational way of coping, maybe wanting to learn more, maybe wanting to read about grief theory or different types of grief, things like that. And then we have people who really, their mode is creativity, and that's what they pour everything into. That's their outlet where they really are able to process emotion. And oftentimes they do that without saying a word to anyone else, right? They speak through their art, and that's where they really put everything. And so there are all these different pathways that you may know you lean towards or find yourself leaning towards. And they're all really healthy ways to explore and process and even express what you've experienced.
Yeah, and I think that with this sort of in an indirect way, thinking about those sorts of styles can connect with the next consideration we wanted to talk about, which is just that we as humans have differences in our need for control, or what sometimes they call in mental health, like mastery over our world. And so if you have been someone who really values being in control, you like to have predictability, you like to have order, you like to feel like you're in charge of things, we know that it can be much harder to tolerate all of the different life changes that come in grief that are outside of our control. You know, as we've said so many times, grief, it can shatter your entire world. It feels like all of a sudden nothing is in your control anymore. And that's distressing for everyone. But if you are someone who really values mastery and values control, it can feel especially difficult for you. And with this, it can also affect how we engage in different types of support. Oftentimes, if we're a person who really likes order and control, really likes to know that we're going to be able to be in control in different situations, sometimes we have a harder time stepping outside of our comfort zone and trying something new if we've never done therapy before or done a support group, or certainly if we've never tried a creative outlet or expression, or if we've never considered that maybe something somatic with body work and physical exercise or something could be useful for us. If that's outside of our comfort zone, we might be less likely to explore because we don't have as much flexibility for if it doesn't work, or if it doesn't go well, or if we feel kind of uncomfortable in a certain situation. So our need for control and mastery, it can make things really hard within grief itself, but then it can also sometimes limit what types of support we choose to explore. And so being able to see that in ourselves, if we can realize, oh, that is me. I'm one of those people that I like the things that I know I control, that are familiar, that I've done before, that are predictable. It can just be good to know that, and then to consider, how is this affecting my grief? How is it affecting my coping? Are there any areas where maybe I should push myself a little bit, or where I should work on tempering my mastery or tempering my need for control a little bit, and getting comfortable in the discomfort, the uncertainty, the unpredictable world that is life after loss? Maybe I need to work with a therapist to really try to increase my skills around that.
Yeah, and I think that this can be a really tough one for people, because grief and loss can push our need for control into overdrive, because oftentimes control and the need for control is a response to anxiety and fear. Like, I don't want to encounter this unpleasant emotion or this unpleasant experience. All of a sudden, the world starts to feel a little more anxious and dangerous for a lot of reasons. And so our need for control may be more pronounced, while at the same time, life feels a little more out of control and unpredictable than ever. One of the things that I feel like grief and loss really forces people to learn to live with is the need to be flexible and to operate sometimes within the unknowns and to maybe change course. Also, other people are grieving. And like we said, we don't know how they're going to respond. We can't control how other people respond and the things they're willing to engage in and do. And so often we need to be flexible about that. And so there's like so many different little things that require the need to be flexible and that we cannot control. And so it's a tough thing for people who really value that sense of control and mastery. But like you said, Lisa, there are ways to kind of work on it and to push ourselves a little bit in our flexibility.
Absolutely. And I think it sort of dovetails into another one we wanted to mention was just our openness to emotion and to sort of feeling the full range of our feelings. And this is not to say that everyone who really values control and mastery is uncomfortable with their emotions. That is definitely not the case. But there are certainly times where sometimes our value of mastery and control can make some people uncomfortable with emotions, because emotions can, especially in grief, feel so overwhelming. It can feel like we're really struggling with control over our emotional experience.
Right. Or it developed, or our need for control developed because we're uncomfortable with certain emotional experiences, right? I don't want to have that emotional experience, so I'm going to control X, Y, and Z so it doesn't happen.
Exactly. And so when we see that, oftentimes we can see that just our openness to emotion, our ability to sit with the huge range of emotions that come up in grief has a real impact on how we grieve, on our kind of our grief style and our coping style. And it is an area where, if you know that's you, maybe you also grew up in a household or a family where emotions were just not normalized, where other people really contained their emotions, you didn't see them, or you were kind of punished in some way, or at least not supported in showing your emotions. Those are all things that we can carry into adulthood. And looking back, it can be helpful to go, all right, how was grief how was grief handled in my childhood? What did I see modeled for me? What emotions was I allowed to have and express? And if you realize that maybe you're on that end of the spectrum of not being as open to emotion, it's one of those places where you may need to practice a little bit of exploration and tolerance, maybe getting support from a counselor or a therapist or other people, and being able to realize that even though you're having emotions that are terrifying, that you're safe, that you're okay, that it's okay to begin the work of learning to feel your feelings and move into that place of being willing to explore your grief in a way that feels safe to you. And that can be harder if it hasn't been part of your world up until now.
Yeah. And I think, just being realistic, there's people at every end of this spectrum, right? And like you said, This is something that often begins in childhood as you watch how your family handles certain things, or the messages you were given, like, oh, don't cry, we need to be strong, things like that. And so this is something that we've carried with us for a long time. So we know, like, not everybody is tomorrow going to be comfortable with every single different emotion. But some things to keep in mind are that if you are fully avoiding certain emotions and certain experiences, certain memories, that can cause a lot of anxiety for people. Like running away from reminders and memories and things like that can get a lot of people into a cycle of anxiety and avoidance that just goes on forever. And it doesn't help you learn how to engage or cope with those things at all. And oftentimes, this just creates a situation where a person has a ton of anxiety. And in grief, it can create a situation where a person ends up cutting themselves off, maybe from good memories of the person who died, or maybe from people and places and things. So that's one thing to keep in mind. If you feel like you are avoiding things because you aren't comfortable with certain emotions, that is definitely something to look at. And the other thing is like, okay, so maybe tomorrow you're not going to all of a sudden identify as an emotional person who's comfortable processing all these emotions, but you still have emotion, right? It's still in there somewhere. And so what are some of the things that do feel comfortable for you to start taking steps towards coping? Yeah. What are those outlets that do feel comfortable? I think sometimes people push back in grief because, like we said in the beginning, the go-to suggestion for people is go to therapy, go to support groups. And what we know is that's just really for a fraction of people, right? That is not for everybody. So I do think a lot of times people feel like immediately kind of like put off by the idea of finding like good grief coping for themselves. Mm-hmm. And so we really encourage you to think like, okay, what are some steps that do feel right? You know, reading books can be a really, really helpful way to cope with grief, to connect with other people's stories, to think through your own story. Maybe that's something that feels accessible and, you know, comfortable for you to go at your own pace and to do in the comfort of your own home, things like that. We talked about creativity, things like that. So just think about what are the steps that do feel comfortable to me, because I did experience a significant loss that has turned my world upside down. And there is a lot of change and thoughts and emotion that comes along with that.
Yeah. I think that it is also important that we mention that, like so many of the other things we're talking about today, there are risks at the other end of the spectrum too. You might think, okay, well, you know, if I'm somebody who's really comfortable with emotions and I'm wonderful at feeling my feelings, I don't have that fear. I grew up in a household where it really normalized all of that. You may think, oh, great, you know, smooth sailing. And in a lot of ways, it can really be helpful if you're more of an intuitive griever and you have comfort with emotion. It can be really wonderful that you feel like you can tap into that and process that with other people. But we do know that on the other end of the spectrum, sometimes people who are really, really connected with their emotional selves sometimes struggle with the boundaries that they have between their emotions and other people's emotions. You may be somebody who feels like you really take on other people's emotions, that you feel them with a deep, deep intensity. And that might be family members and friends, but it might even be strangers and other people's stories. It might be if you're reading a grief memoir or just encountering another person in a support group or on an internet forum, that you just feel their emotions incredibly deeply, which can feel overwhelming in your own grief when you're already having those emotions. It may also be that in your family or with friends that you may feel their emotions deeply and struggle with feeling both affected by that, or sometimes maybe even like a little responsible for helping to them to fix their feelings, quote unquote. And that can get us into some trouble too. So if you are somebody who feels really comfortable with your emotions, it can be important to recognize, does it feel sometimes like too much because of how you take on other people's emotions? And if that's the case, you may, if you're considering or in a support group or using forums online or really a primary support person for friends and family in your life, you may want to think about what you need to kind of shore up your own resources and boundaries and be mindful about when and how you connect with other people to make sure that you're not depleting yourself and you know, to make sure that you're mindful of your tolerance for taking on so much emotion.
Yeah, I think that really closely connects to the last one I wanted to throw in here. And this, I guess, maybe because we work in mental health, I meet people all the time who say this about themselves. But if you know that you are somebody who immediately in a crisis shifts into that caregiving mode, that is also something to consider. Caregivers get a lot of benefit out of giving care and out of being able to take care of other people and being there for other people. But like you were saying, Lisa, it can also be very, very depleting. And it can also create a dynamic where you're giving so much of yourself that you're not taking time for yourself. I will say also, if you are somebody who goes into caregiver mode, this also might be a really comfortable space to sit and avoid your own stuff, right? So if I'm focusing on everybody else around me, I don't really have to put my own needs front and center. I don't have to really think through my own stuff. I'm so worried about everyone else's stuff. And so if you are somebody who knows that that is you, I think just being aware, it's a wonderful quality to have, but also being aware of maybe when it will create a dynamic where you're giving too much, where you're getting depleted, or where you're not able to really focus on your own needs and your own grief and grief coping. So,
yeah, I think that's incredibly important. And it can also, on the other side of that, be important to remember if you're someone who maybe has always been very much taken care of by others. You've had a caretaker in your life who you lost, and you're struggling with that, you may be someone who needs to think about, how do I start to shift into feeling a little bit more autonomous, a little bit more comfortable and confident with myself and my own independence. This can be an area where we really see a lack of resources, or people not acknowledging how much we can lose our confidence in grief, especially if the person that you lost was a real cheerleader for you, or a person who really helped you with decision making and helped you in important moments in your own life. And so that can really lead to feelings of sometimes paralysis of, how do I even figure out how to take care of myself when I lost the person who always took care of me and helped me figure out how to take care of myself.
Yeah.
So that's definitely a time where getting some outside support, knowing it's not ever going to replace the person in your life who was there for you, but to help you think about how you build up some of your internal self-care can be really valuable.
Yeah, of course, whether it was a parent or a partner or even a best friend, or not even a best friend, just a friend who you saw regularly. I think when someone dies or is not present in our life, we realize, wow, they filled all these different spaces in my life, some that I was well aware of and some that I maybe didn't even know. I didn't notice they were filling that space for me. And so I do think that our need to be felt, taken care of, and loved absolutely can be compromised significantly. And so that is something, of course, to think about. So, well, okay, that's a couple of factors. There's, of course, more, but I think those were the main ones that we wanted to touch on today. If you want to email us your thoughts on this, you can always reach out to us at whatsyourgrief@gmail.com. Please also email us if you have any topic suggestions or specific questions you would like to see addressed on the podcast. And until then, we'll talk soon.
See you next time.